Welcome to the Age of Reason. I am your host, the Neo-Atheist, Mike Phelps. And with me tonight, I actually have a surprise guest. We have David Pierce, the amazing, monumental genius that is Pierce. I'm glad to have him on the panel tonight. He was a last-minute addition. That is a complete surprise to me. He's someone that was a childhood hero to me. He's one of the reasons I'm actually a transhumanist today. So it's a pleasure to actually have him on the panel tonight. But let's break into introductions and get them out of the way. First and foremost, my wingman, the Foxhole Atheist. Randy, welcome. How are you doing tonight?
Had to unmute there. Yeah, I'm doing great. It's good to be here. I'm the Foxhole Atheist, Randy Bevan. I'm a YouTuber and the co-host of the Age of Reason.
And that is the amazing man coming to you from the Bronx, New York. David, how are you doing tonight?
Brooklyn.
It's all New York City to me.
No way. No. Get it right. Brooklyn. Yeah, I finally figured out my technical difficulties. You're right. Just restarting the computer. That's another story, but it worked.
But
hello, everyone. Hey, Rowan. Hey, hey, Foxhole. And David, first time meeting. Nice to hear your. Well, see you moving in like video, or I've seen you in video, but you know, live video.
Well, yes.
And Andres again. Hi, hello.
The always colorful introduction of David Saintlow.
Well,
welcome,
was
David.
that the introduction? I thought that was just like a prelim. That was.
Okay,
no,
David. So, Ronan Horn, welcome.
Hello, I'm Rowan Horn. I'm the founder of the Eternal Life fan club. So what I do is I obsess about living forever. That's my main goal in life, is to live forever and help other people live forever, and end death, end involuntary death, and end aging, so that we can exist for as long as we want to. Because I think that's the most important thing in life, is existence. So,
existence.
Nice to be on the show.
Well, it's always a pleasure to have you here, Ronan. Now, with us tonight, we also have the amazing, the monumental, this guy is a hero to me. I mean, if there was anyone that could show up to this show in a cape looking like Superman, it would be David Pierce. That's how monumental and an inspiration this man is to me. So, David Pierce, welcome to the panel. How are you tonight?
Very good to be with you. Very good indeed.
So, you want to do a brief introduction of how you are able to talk about the future of consciousness tonight? Though I feel like it's a shortcoming asking you this question, because to me, you are the man that wrote the book that started me on this journey.
Yeah, well, just in case anyone hasn't followed this saga, many years ago, when the net was young, I wrote something called The Hedonistic Imperative, which is not quite as decadent and sensual as it sounds. Essentially, as you know, I argue that we can and should and probably will use biotechnology to phase out the biology of suffering, and with any luck, future life should be animated by gradients of bliss that are orders of magnitude richer than anything physiologically feasible today.
Hear, hear.
Well, it is a pleasure to have you here tonight, and thank you for giving us that colorful introduction. Right next to you, though, we have the president of the Stanford Transhumanist Association. Welcome, Andres. How are you feeling tonight?
Hey, I'm feeling great. Thanks for inviting me again. The future of consciousness is definitely what brought me to transhumanism. It's something that I've been thinking about for a long time. How futurists, not all of them, but a lot of them, focus on things such as flying cars or going to Mars. When I was a kid, the thing that fascinated me about the future was the kinds of experiences that people might have, which are completely incommensurable with the kind of experiences that we have nowadays. But that's something that I've dedicated a lot of my brain cycles to. It's Yeah, I have lots of things to say for tonight, hopefully. So thanks again for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, with the introductions out of the way, we will be having Zoltan Istvan join us in around 25 to 10:30, 10:30 to 10:25. Within that 5-minute time frame, Zoltan will be joining us. So we'll actually break into the topic and we'll do an introduction for him once he actually joins us tonight. Now, someone that always has thoughts on what to add, and he's as long-winded as the city he comes from, David Saintlow, you want to start us off on your thoughts about the topic at hand tonight, the future of consciousness?
Well, the very topic, to me, I'm thinking, well, future of consciousness, we still haven't figured out what the hell consciousness is. So, I mean, when we think about the future of consciousness, I mean, we have to back up a bit and think about what, here I am, I'm an engineer, I'm a computer scientist, I'm actually doing the work in the entrepreneurship that I'm on right now is exploring machine learning as an approach to understand cognition at some point in the future. And those are questions which are really big questions that we don't have settled yet. As David will definitely agree with me on, that we don't know what consciousness is now, and so it's very difficult to really talk about what the future of consciousness is. We start on this platform where we're really all guessing. I think we have to agree upon that point, where we're all guessing about what consciousness is. Some of us may think we know what it is right now, but that's a very different perspective to be in when you're going to then go ahead and extrapolate and say, okay, what's the future of consciousness? Was I not long-winded enough?
No, you were actually perfect.
I think you raised a great point there. Sam Harris talks about consciousness a lot, and he's one of the guys that, from his point of view, it seems like he thinks we're getting pretty close to it, but I think even he would agree that we're just not there yet.
To understanding it.
Yes.
Yes.
He's one of those people that would actually say we're on the precipice of understanding what consciousness is. The more we actually research what the neurochemical and the neurological pattern of the brain and the role that they play in consciousness itself. Once we understand that, that'll be the first steps into understanding what consciousness is. At least that's Sam Harris's view on the subject.
Absolutely.
Now, so, with that actually being said, though, let's go to the subject matter expert tonight and hand the topic over to him. So, David Pierce, what's your thoughts on the topic tonight?
Well, in a fundamental sense, I have to agree with David. We simply do not understand consciousness. If our orthodox materialist understanding of physics is correct, we ought to be zombies. We're not, or at least one of us isn't a zombie, and so we have to explain this. Consciousness poses a problem for materialists in the same way that fossils pose a problem for biblical literalists. Now, I think of myself as a scientific rationalist, and ultimately I think consciousness does have a scientific explanation, but I think it's going to take a revolution to deliver it. And in order to understand the future of consciousness, I think we're going to need to pursue the experimental method, pioneered not least by the late Sater Shulgin. Today it's considered quite respectable to write long screeds about consciousness without actually exploring systematically different agents that modulate our state of consciousness. But I think we're almost in the kind of pre-Galilean era when it comes to investigating consciousness. I will just say just one more thing before passing the baton on. One has to be very, very cautious before urging people to try these radical consciousness-altering drugs, because one cannot make an informed choice in advance about their effects. And one of the reasons I am so interested, and one of the reasons interested in radical mood enrichment and invincible well-being, is so that essentially we can all safely become psychonauts. Whereas today, unfortunately, yeah, the possibility of bad trips is ever present for many people. So yes, I at the same time urge the experimental method, but also urge extreme caution too. It's almost impossible to to stress how radically alien these altered state spaces of consciousness are. Most drug-naive people have simply no idea what is out there.
Oh,
That's actually great.
yeah, it's a huge point. I mean, when you think about altered states of consciousness, now getting back to, I think now that we've agreed that no one knows what the hell consciousness is, right? We kind of agreed that. My perspective as an engineer, right, as someone who's actually working on trying to build a dynamic cognition at some point in code in the next 10 years or so, is that we can approach it by looking at the concept from the perspective of what it is that makes us, what it is that drives us. So from a year ago or so, I published to my blog this idea of a salience theory of dynamic cognition, which is based on this idea of these autonomic or emotional drivers being the important elements of what define what consciousness ultimately is. And these are things that I've been piecing together in terms of code and writing in various articles that I've put on my blog. But fundamentally, the idea is that consciousness is this effort to satiate these internal drives, whether they be emotional or autonomic drives, right? For sex, for food, to be warm, and these are the ultimate basic things that drive us and lead our different dimensions of conscious representation, right? So we have these layers on the neocortex that uniquely describe in some way the ability to process certain types of incoming signals, whether they be auditory or gustatory or olfactory or somatosensory, whatever they happen to be. And then somewhere in the core of the brain, what's amazing is that, the last 10 years we've been able to, using functional magnetic resonance imaging, look at how these little networks are working internally and see these connections between these deeper regions of the brain and the neocortex, and see these circuits running. And so, again, remember, I have the bias of an engineer here, so I'm always going to interject the engineer bias, right? Because I learned signals theory and signal analysis and all of these things, which maybe neuroscientists, the people who have actually done the neuroscience work on the neurotransmitters and neuromodulators, they're not aware of what we're doing over in control systems theory. And so I think that the merging of these different areas is a very important part that we're at right now, where different people from these different areas of understanding these different approaches of cognitive models or learning models, whether they be by a computational model or whether they be by a biological model, coming together. And now we're at this point where, wow, we can actually try to solve this problem.
If I can sort of jump in right there, though, David, not to cut you off. I mean, you are from New York, so, I mean, you're used to being very long-winded as usual. So I'll just dance on that one and hand it over to...
You keep tapping me.
Andres, what's your thoughts on the everything that St. Lo just said?
Oh, yeah, okay. So, engineering bias. The undergraduate program that I went through, it's called Symbolic Systems. It combines philosophy, computer science, linguistics, and psychology. Very much like the kind of combination that David is talking about. And it doesn't seem clear to me that knowledge about these things would lead you to conclude that really you would understand consciousness, but look at the circuit level representation of the information processing of the brain. I think you can have all the information processing that you want. That wouldn't explain phenomenal experience. Now, I don't even think that really
I
having
agree.
deep, hold on, I don't even think that having a deep discussion about what is consciousness is really all that necessary in order to actually be able to engineer it. I think you can go ahead and engineer a lot of things without actually fundamentally understanding the ontological components of them. You can see like lots of people making wonderful steam engines without like necessarily knowing from the start the laws of thermodynamics or all sorts of other devices. Like we ourselves like don't understand information theory deeply. Like there's so much to be discovered. Yet we can send signals and understand each other. I think likewise with consciousness engineering, I think we will get started and get into incredible realms of consciousness before like having any clue of like what we're doing. We won't be immoral because we won't be experiencing suffering or maybe making others experience suffering. One interesting point I think is that it seems, and I definitely don't want to get into a very long, heated debate about this, but the David.
That's what we're here for. Do it.
Yeah, okay. The David Senlat might be understanding consciousness at the algorithmic level, and then making the confusion that consciousness is the algorithm. And here is where we have to introduce what's called the hierarchy of Mar, or like Mar's levels of intelligence. There are 3 levels at which you can understand an information processing system. First, you have the computational level. What is it doing? What kind of computation is it solving? And one example I use is the abacus. Like in the abacus, the computational level is it's doing additions, subtractions, multiplications. Then you have the algorithmic level, and that is how is it processing that information. In the abacus, you're like moving one bed one at a time, and that represents the addition operation, and so on and so forth. Finally, when you come to the implementation level, that is how concretely those algorithms are being instantiated. What I would claim is that an analysis of this sort into human experience would say that, yes, you can characterize the algorithms of consciousness, and maybe you can characterize, in a sense, pain response in terms of reinforcement learning, if you want. However, there are many ways to implement a reinforcement algorithm, and just because you implemented a reinforcement algorithm doesn't mean that
well, can I jump in on here? Just listening, of course, you guys are much more qualified to speak on this than me, but, it sounds like David was mostly talking about ways we could potentially go about to try to understand consciousness, which we don't understand yet. And it seems like you're talking about the applications we could still use without...
Foxhole, if I can actually jump in here for a second already.
Hang on, I'm almost done, Mike. And so what I'm hearing here is I don't find either of these positions to be mutually exclusive, right? And so we can still
See, Randy,
use this and
what
build.
they're actually doing right now is it's 2 different sides of the coin. It's basically outlining, one is the practical applications and one is designing the practical applications, which is basically what the engineer of the topic is actually outlining. He's outlining the ways to get to what Andres is actually saying.
Yeah, that's pretty much what
no, but I think Foxhole's correct. I mean, in that we're not mutually exclusive in our approaches. What I'm saying is that there are concrete approaches that can get us to forms of consciousness. Remember, consciousness is a landscape. We have like a bunch of us probably have read Gianni Tonini's really amazing paper on integrated information theory that he published about a dozen years ago that describes this incredibly amazing theory regarding what consciousness is, being this quality escape, as he describes in the paper, and that really what we are is a tiny sliver, a tiny slice, like a spectrum, like in the EM spectrum, right? We can only see this tiny slice of frequencies, right? And of the available frequencies out there. So in a sense, our consciousness is just a tiny slice of the potential for variation across cognitive models that can exist out there. From and in integrated information theory, this includes things like a switching states, like, you know, for a switch, literally, like a physical switch,
Yeah.
all the way up to a human being, you know. And the point is as an engineer, I'm trying to create an approach which can allow us to map a sufficient amount of the human cognitive landscape that we can actually have agents that we can create, which we can actually interact with and
So that's where
not have.
actually understanding the basic neural pattern of the brain comes into play. Understanding the basic building blocks, and once we actually understand that, that's going to be the first entry steps into actually viewing and perceiving consciousness itself. It's
Absolutely.
understanding the housing of consciousness, which is the cerebral cortex.
Absolutely, but this gets back to what I was saying earlier about salience being such an important thing. I think that salience is the switching factor. I think salience is what allows you to go from, like, look, just now you just took a sip of your drink, right? What told you to prioritize sipping that drink over continuing the thought that you had in your mind, right? So you're at some point you had a salience evaluation in your core that said, I need this drink now, right? And so we do this all the time. We're constantly skipping across these different evaluations, across these different representations of our cognitive experience, right? Because we're experiencing the world across all of these pretty much separate dimensions, right? The auditory, gustatory. Andres is very familiar with bases in linear algebra, right? Right? You took this stuff. So if you think of the emotions in terms of these bases as these independent dimensions that are orthogonally placed, you have auditory, you have gustatory, you have somatosensory, and you have these dimensions which are being input along these distinct input factors, right? Your eyes, your ears, your skin, right? And these are being mapped to your neocortical surface, and that neocortical surface is then integrated in these interesting ways in the deeper parts of the brain, the amygdala, right? The hippocampus, these areas of the brain, which then create this. There's a cycle that happens there where you're jumping across these different chasms of representation that are happening in the mind, right? The neocortex, we know, is pretty much all about gathering this information from these.
It's not just understanding the information at where it's gathered and where it's located. It's understanding the neurons that fire off in different situations. That's basically part of the basic fundamentals itself that go with understanding the housing of consciousness at its core dynamic.
This is where I would probably disagree. I think that knowing about the details is less important, and I'll give you an example of why I think that's the case. So about 2 weeks ago, I think I told you this, Mike, probably at the last talk, but about 2 weeks ago I attended, well, it was 3 weeks ago, I attended a talk at one of these venture capital companies. So New York is like really exploding right now with all kinds of venture capital and startups and ITs and everything and all that good stuff. And I attend these meetings all the time, and I'm a part of the New York City Brains and Bots meetup. And at this meetup, what's his name? Dan Fergus, who works with Jan LeCun at Facebook, in Facebook New York, on their vision processing systems, came in and gave a talk on their cutting-edge convolution neural network approach. And this is the cutting edge of applying cognitive models to figuring out the vision problem. And at the end of this talk, he was very forward and stated that they had no idea how their neural network was figuring out these things. They knew, right? They could tell you about the convolution.
See, I'm going to rebut, David. I'm going to rebut what you just said in a second, but I do have to hand it over to one of my favorite authors. Well, one of my favorite authors on the panel tonight, because there is David Pierce with us tonight too. So, Zoltan, it's always a pleasure. How are you tonight?
I'm doing good. I hope everyone can hear me loud and clear. Thank you for having me.
Yes,
Hi,
we can.
Zoltan.
Hi, Zoltan.
Hello, hello. But please continue because I'm just catching up, so I'm looking forward to it.
Okay.
But
So-
see,
I got a quick question here. So this will
actually, Foxhole, hold on a second, Foxhole. I'm actually going. I got a rebuttal for Mr. St. Lo over there. Now, that's where understanding how different neurons fire off in different situations play an intricate role. Because if you're going to actually be building and improving on consciousness itself, you have to understand the basic fundamentals of how neurons are firing off and the purpose they serve.
No, you don't.
Okay.
I think this is what I was going to bring it back to Andreas here with my well, a little bit with David as well, David Pierce. But it seems to me that David St. Lo here is explaining a good way, more or less, to try and get us to build an aware AI. And Andreas has got an idea that we can probably apply a lot of these things before we actually fully understand them, and potentially build an AI with consciousness before we understand consciousness. And so the question I was going to have is for David Pierce. You know, what do you make of all this?
Yeah. So far, we haven't really explained why we're not zombies. I don't actually think zombies are possible, but nonetheless, given our understanding of the fundamental stuff of the world, no one has yet so far closed the explanatory gap and explained why it's not possible to have counterparts like you and me saying the same things, having the same conversation now, and yet it not even being all dark inside. I think it's useful to distinguish three problems. One, why does consciousness exist at all? Two, how on earth is the binding problem solved, which I'll come to in a second? And three, what explains this tremendous diversity of different qualitative experiences we have, and how we reconcile these three aims for any satisfactory theory with what seems to be the completeness of physics, or at least tomorrow's physics, because it really does seem as though the equations of physics exhaustively describe the behavior of the stuff of the world. I just want to say a little bit before passing on to Andres, the binding problem. It's not as familiar to some people as the problem of consciousness, but it's worth stating. How is it that in spite of the way that within our brains, apparently, there are edge detectors, motion detectors, color detectors, but nonetheless we experience unitary bound objects as part of a unitary perceptual scene apprehended by a unitary self? Why aren't we just mind dust? Assuming that our neurons are essentially classical, there doesn't seem to be any explanation as to how these discrete pixels of mind dust are bound together. By analogy, imagine the United States, the population of the United States, skull-bound minds. Imagine they agree to participate in an experiment. You know, they're communicating via reciprocal electromagnetic communication. Whatever computation one imagines the population of skull-bound minds implementing, does some pan-continental subjective experience switch on? If individual skull-bound minds experience a note, is a symphony heard? If individual skull-bound minds experience a pinprick, is there ever agony? At no stage, short of an unexplained miracle, does a unitary consciousness seem to switch on. And this is the analogy. Why is it that our brains, at least some of the time, are different? Why aren't we just 86 billion neurons, discrete membrane-bound neurons? And one way to bring home the sheer computational power of phenomenal binding is to look at rare neurological cases of people who partially lack it. And if someone who has simultanagnosia, for instance, can only see one object at once, or someone with motion blindness can't actually apprehend motion. The car is here, the car is there. It's and someone, of course, with florid schizophrenia does not have a unitary self. These conditions are extremely debilitating, and here's a confession, although in one sense I'm extremely orthodox in my science. As I said, I'm a physicalist. I think the equations of physics exhaustively describe the behavior of the stuff of the world. I'm a quantum mind person. I don't think phenomenal binding is a classical phenomenon. Now, I could say much more, but I'm going to pass the baton on now.
Yeah, I would like just to add that even though, like David Sandlot, you seem to think that the views are compatible. After hearing more clearly what you have to say, I would have to restate that it seems to me that you're confusing the algorithmic level and the implementation level, because you're stating that if we essentially instantiate the adequate algorithms, then you will have the mind. And we can go on with the following analogy. Like, imagine that you have a quantum computer, and you're like looking at the circuits of the quantum computer, and you say, okay, we can implement this computer with buckets of water because computation is substrate independent. The moment you make a huge computer analog to the quantum computer that you were trying to emulate, circuit by circuit, you won't actually get the same computations, because the thing that was doing a computation was the quantum component. Likewise, it might be the case that you can replicate neuron by neuron in a machine the operations of the brain. You wouldn't get sentience, and you wouldn't get the same computations, because the biggest fuel, or like the most strong horse of computational power in the brain, might be the phenomenal binding that is going on. And that is something that, yeah, we don't understand, and we can't conceive how it would go on classically.
So
I can actually jump in there, Andres. That actually goes back to the point I was trying to bring home to Saintlo, correct?
Mm-hmm.
Yes, that you have to understand what's going on at the finite level when neurons are actually firing off and it's going on in the connective states itself, which goes back to the point I was making. Thank you for backing me up on that point. Not that this was a New York feud going on, but I feel like I just got some validation from Stanford.
Can I interject here?
Go ahead.
Here's the thing. When we're talking about neuron states, right? I'm not opposed. Again, this is an important thing that needs to be quantified, right? Action potentials need to be approximated in some way if you're going to create this representation of a cognitive state. Now, getting back to what Andres just said, you guys just admitted that you're proponents of this idea of a quantum consciousness, which, as a person who's right, that's essentially what you're describing, right? Because you're saying that the binding problem is a problem. I don't see the binding problem as a problem at all. I actually see it as something which we can attack using classical methods, as you just described. And the reason why I see that is because of the work of, people like Alan Turing, right? Now, the fundamental work that he did describes that we are Turing machines fundamentally. Yes, there are quantum systems. Well, come on. There are quantum systems within biology. We know now that lots of birds use quantum methods in order to do things like sense magnetic or electric fields, and these sorts of things are awesome. But how do you then enable a quantum system to work across the centimeters or inches of space that are necessary to maintain these coherent states that would need to create this cohesion that you describe as consciousness? So, I mean, the difficulty is on our side as well. I'm not saying that classical representations of the mind are an easy thing. I mean, we've been working at it we've been working since Minsky and, these guys, right? We've been trying, and we suck at it, yes. But the quantum...
David, you actually make some great points there, not to try to get you to sort of expedite it, but I do want to hand it over to Ronan and Zoltan.
Go on.
So, if you can just sum up in 50 words or less, what's your basis synopsis here?
Right, the basis is very simple. So, as I said, here is Andres making this statement about the quantum consciousness, kind of this approach of thinking about it. And I'm saying that from a classical method, I think we can approach a solution to consciousness maybe it's not going to be exactly the same as human consciousness, but what's fundamentally important to me is that whatever it is that we emerge is something that we can control in some way, or that at least we can guide in some way. And this gets to Elon Musk's recent statement about the demon, right? Because
Yeah,
you
but
don't want to summon
we
the
are
demon.
getting into ethic ramifications there for a second. So before we actually dip into that that subcategory of the topic at hand, let's actually get a few of the more quiet members of the panel to share their input on this. Zoltan, it's always a pleasure to talk to you, my friend.
Hey, thanks definitely for this and for having me. You know, let me first say that unlike some of the other people here, I'm not an expert on this, and I'm certainly not an expert on either consciousness or AI or some of these ideas. But just from a philosophical perspective, I think I can say pretty confidently that no matter what happens, no matter what outcome we have when we come to either creating an AI with consciousness or just replicating our own consciousness, it's not going to be like our own consciousness. It's going to be probably significantly different. By the time we actually get to a point when we could actually, for example, get an artificial intelligence to have a consciousness, we're going to have such computing power that is beyond probably even recognition to any of our thoughts right now, and the ability to tap into that. And that in itself will probably make this idea of consciousness quite different, potentially much more powerful, potentially much more diverse, potentially much more creative. And so I'm skeptical to try to determine or distinguish what it is, you know, that we would probably end up with, let's say, in 10, 15 years when the research actually catches up to the things we're speaking about, because I think at that point it will be so much more evolved than our concept of it right now that we may not even necessarily recognize it. And in 50 years, it will be probably so substantially different that you know, it'll be probably magical to the kind of things we're actually speaking about now. And of course, that's just my philosophical perspective with no serious engineering background or no serious scientific background regarding some of these things.
Well, thank you for that, Zoltan. It's always a pleasure to hear you talk about such subjects. Ronan, Horn, what's your thoughts on what's been said thus far?
Well, when it comes to the issue of consciousness, to me it's all a question of survival. That's, to me, is the most important topic here. And I have to bring up the elephant in the room here, which is that whatever consciousness is, it's clear that we need to have it in order to have any meaning, right? We need to have a consciousness to experience anything, to have any fun, to have any hedonistic pleasures, any kind of anything. We need to be alive. We need to have a consciousness. And we can debate about, you know, what is consciousness, but to me the more important focus is whatever it is, how to preserve it, right? If we don't have a consciousness, we have nothing. This whole conversation, what we're doing here, is going to be meaningless if in 100 years we're all dead, right? It's going to be meaningless to us. So the issue is, how do we preserve whatever this thing is, this awesome, magical, cool thing called consciousness? And that's just the crux of the matter. Is we have to realize the horrible situation that we're in, that when our brain dies, we don't know if there's any kind of life after death, so it's smartest just to assume that there is no such thing as life after death, because there's no proof for it. So we have to preserve the physical brain. So that's the focus. I like to just bring the focus back to there, and we need to cure aging, and that's just the whole central theme of what I try to do.
Well, that's actually a great point to toss it over to my wingman, the Foxhole Atheist. Randy, what's your thoughts on what's been said so far?
Well, I think that I find myself, you know, I'm not really picking a camp here. I'm finding a lot of value in what everyone's saying. David St. Lowe's got some great ideas about how to potentially get us to understanding consciousness. What is that?
No, that was basically me just nitpicking at David St. Lowe for a second. But continue your train of thought.
And so I think that Rowan really makes a great point here. It's this consciousness. I mean, you used magic. It really is almost magic to us because we have so little understanding. In the way that Zoltan mentioned that computing power in the future might be. This thing almost appears magic to us, and whether we understand it or not, I think that I like some of Andreas's points that I think we can still do some things with it even though we don't fully understand it. And I'm very interested to see where we're going to go with that.
Yeah. Can I say something?
Yes, please.
Okay. So when I say like we can engineer consciousness even without knowing what it is, the main area of inquiry, I think, is like by modifying our own brains. Definitely with substances, that's one thing. Other things is with electric current, up to genetics, genetic engineering. That seems to me the most viable way for the short-term exploration of the nature of consciousness and the varieties of it. For sure, like a computer-aided exploration of consciousness, that's going to be a big thing. I'm skeptical of the possibility of consciousness in computers. I don't discard it, and I think it's an extremely important possibility to consider.
I would agree with you there.
Then the other point is one person might say, well, there's like it's impossible to know whether another entity is conscious, and here is where I have actually like thought about it and come up with a test that I think is much better than the Turing test. The Turing test, I think, it actually doesn't work because your dream characters has a Turing test, and you don't want to say they're independently conscious, but the test I have is essentially use the same kind of brain tissue that you have that connects your two hemispheres in the corpus callosum in order to connect your brain to another person's brain. And I think in that way, you would essentially become one entity with the other person. The experience, I have no idea what it would be, but I'm guessing it would be something like suddenly waking up, having two visual fields, having two bodies, and having the ability to recollect what two persons experienced in the past. Now, this brings up, obviously, the
wild idea.
Personal identity, like who am I if I'm not my memories? And I think the solution is
that sounds like Pacific Rim, that movie, which is a fascinating movie.
Oh, yes, I think I give kudos to the makers of that movie for introducing that philosophical issue, because I think it's something we have all to confront. And I think it's very illuminating, because if you don't consider these issues, you might believe that you have one consciousness that is distinct than the consciousness of everybody else, and therefore think that when you die, it's just going to be utter blackness for you because you lack the consciousness. Instead, the kind of view that I tend to have is you don't have consciousness. In fact, there's consciousness. That's all there is. It's sort of like light, and you can instantiate it in a brain, and whenever you go to sleep, it's not there, but you don't carry consciousness with you all the time, because you stop existing from second to second. There's only instances of consciousness. That is something that makes a little bit more sense, in my humble opinion, about the problem of personal identity.
Which is interesting to me, because it sounds like a contradiction to the quantum consciousness idea to me.
How so?
The binding, the whole idea of a binding problem. If you're talking about instances of consciousness, you're talking about discrete points of understanding. You're basically agreeing with my perspective, which is that is all we have. We have these instances of understanding salience evaluations across the different dimensions of sensory experience. So that's the same thing.
It's not quite, because there is this distinction between synchronic binding and asynchronic binding. So
what is that distinction?
At a given point in time, you have a visual field that is integrating information from various parts, and you're like looking at those pieces of information simultaneously, but you're not looking at your current visual field and your future visual field at the same time. So those two are disconnected. You right now and you in a couple seconds are different instances of consciousness, but within an instance of consciousness, everything is connected, and that is where the binding problem arises.
I disagree with that. I think that what's happening is you have parallelism, right? We know that parallelism is deeply built into the brain. The cortex is able to, while you're looking at something, the deeper parts of your brain are processing it, evaluating, bringing up memories, determining how salient it is, whether or not you should care about it in that moment. All of these things. So you have this multiple experience of conscious and unconscious evaluations of your signals that are coming in across all these dimensions of sensory experience. I don't think it's there's this holistic this homunculus of processing, right? I don't think that that's necessary. I mean, we could. I mean, we're just arbitrary.
Can I just
dig too far?
I might just briefly interject here. Ultimately, fortunately, this isn't going to be a purely philosophical issue.
Exactly.
It's also amenable to experimental test, because if, and it's a big if, the mind-brain is a quantum computer, we should be able to detect indirectly quantum coherent neuronal superpositions. And
across large distances.
It is the case that, as I said, phenomenal binding is not a classical phenomenon. Not merely via next generation interferometry will one be able to detect these quantum coherent neuronal superpositions. If this is the case, that phenomenal binding is a quantum phenomenon, all and only these particular synchronously firing cells will be implicated in the result. So two results will need to be found. Now, as David will point out, in an environment as warm and noisy as the brain, thermally induced decoherence effectively destroys these quantum coherent superpositions at intuitively ridiculously short timescales. But nonetheless, this is ultimately an empirical issue, an experimental issue that will be resolved by next generation interferometry.
100% I agree on that.
Well, since it's actually been fun, though, if we can actually switch it over to Zoltan, since we've only got him for another 9 minutes. What's your thoughts, Zoltan, on the ethical implications of what's been said so far tonight?
Well, and I'll stay a little bit longer. It sounds like my family is doing okay. Sorry, I have 2 young kids that I'm constantly dealing with, and especially in my wife as well. So.
Superpower, Dad.
Luckily, I have earphones on, so you can't hear him in the background. There's a 7-month-old and a 4-year-old. But again, coming from the non-scientific point of view, the whole idea with the ethics involved in kind of discovering a new consciousness is really, what is it going to lead us to? Is it going to make us better as transhuman entities? Is it going to make us more complex? Is it going to lead us down a path that's going to essentially become sort of some type of gods or something like that? And the answer for me is probably. Will it cause bigger problems down the road? Probably not. I think the universe is large enough to hold us for quite a huge amount of increasing of whatever our consciousness is. I think just one of the things I routinely think is that we seem to think that as human beings, this is our reality. But I know from taking some substances, know from various other things that I've done in my life that there's a huge amount that we don't know. I'm constantly surprised on a daily basis. And I'm only surprised by these most basic things. Sometimes I wonder what it'd be like when we really actually are able to tap into our brain, or as Andres has said, combine our brains. And why only 2? What about 3 or 4 or 5? What kind of possibilities are there? Why keep the hemisphere just 2 hemispheres? What about cutting them in half and see what happens then? And there's this amazing capability, the possibilities that we don't actually know what really will happen. And it's just going to take experimentation to kind of discover. But I'm quite certain whatever happens, sort of like our view of how the Earth was, everyone thought it was flat, 1,000 or 2,000 years ago. We're probably going to realize that consciousness is so much more complex than we ever thought. That consciousness is not just this human perspective of 2 + 2 = 4, and that's the reality, and it's something physical, but actually that there might be multiple universes, there might be multiple things going on, there might be ideas and concepts that we have never ever thought before. As I did my senior thesis in philosophy on brains in a vat. And I can tell you after my 24 pages of doing that, essentially the idea that we are, our brains are being controlled by some other entity, and they're poking us, and that's what's giving us consciousness. But I can tell you after doing that, the thing I came up with was there's really no way to know exactly what it is that we have right now. I'm not sure if in the future there will also be a way. It may just keep getting bigger and bigger and more complex. But the one thing that is for certain is that we're going to be discovering a lot more than we know right now, and that may make the things we're saying now almost juvenile or almost so sophomoric that we were going to look back and almost laugh at ourselves as we kind of laughed when we said that the Earth was flat. So I just, as everyone's talking their ideas, and it's fascinating because I wanted to be on this specific program because I don't know much about consciousness, and I love neuroscience. To discover more and to see where we can go, but I'm sure whatever we think, it's going to be, you know, many, many more times more complex.
But see, Zoltan, I completely agree with the points you've made from an ethical standpoint. But at the core of it, it's your status of mind of what you believe consciousness actually is, or perceive consciousness as. Because if you limit your perception of consciousness only being Homo sapiens, that's something that plays at the core of it. Because there are other species on this planet that do somehow show that there's a consciousness at play in those species. If we go into the next generation of consciousness with that mindset, from an ethical standpoint at least, it will give us a newfound respect for when we actually do see consciousness form from an artificial capacity.
This is why I mentioned integrated information theory earlier. I don't know if anyone's read the paper by Gianni Tononi, but he basically describes this landscape, this qualiascape, which includes, as I said earlier, switches, literally, like a physical switch to a conscious agent, a biological agent like ourselves, and in between there you have rats, and you have mice, and you have cats, and you have people, and these are all representations of ways of thinking about solving various problems, right? Experiences that are input through some kind of sensory apparatus and then processed in order to determine some kind of salience evaluation. So again, you know, I keep getting back to this concept of salience. Salience, I think, is the driver. It's the engine. It's like in an internal combustion engine, what creates that catalytic process? It's this sequential firing of the spark plugs in the gas chamber. And
it's basically understanding, just to add to what you're actually saying, though, David,
right.
It's understanding the evolutionary basis for where consciousness derives itself from.
Correct.
If we can actually understand that, we'll understand that at least the core concepts of the mechanisms, and that will give us at least our roadmap of what consciousness is, which will actually allow us to artificially create it.
Correct, which starts, in my view, in my conception, it starts with salience. So
exactly, I would completely agree with that.
Can I just interject here? I think most of us do have implicitly this kind of dimmer switch model of consciousness, with humans as the most cognitively complex creatures, as the most intensely conscious, you know, and then down inverted the phylogenetic tree, chimpanzees, pigs, rats, and perhaps insects. But if you look at the most intense forms of consciousness, unbearable pain, orgasmic bliss, blind panic, they're also the most intense, whereas the most cognitively sophisticated human abilities, you know, like the ability to solve equations or generative syntax, they're phenomenologically extremely thin and extremely subtle. So yes, I'm much more cautious about theories that link consciousness or intensity of consciousness to informational complexity. I just don't think the evidence is there. All sorts of systems in the world, you know, think of the financial markets, for instance, a fantastically complicated information processing system, but there's no evidence that, you know, the financial markets are a unitary subject of experience.
See, what David Pierce actually just said is a perfect example of what the point I was actually trying to get at. I mean, it's more of a gray area when it comes down to what consciousness actually is. I mean, when it comes to problem solving, look at the other higher mammals on the evolutionary chain. I mean, look at marine mammals, for example. Their sonar abilities are something that are completely radical to us, and that's something that allows them to perceive the world in a completely different way that
Right.
not to mention, we have seen through experimentation and through tests that have been done with marine mammals that they're able to have the same cognitive problem-solving capabilities as Homo sapiens.
I have to interject here. Don't make the mistake of thinking that I think that human consciousness is at some kind of the pinnacle of the triangle in terms of this is nonsense. As I mentioned earlier, there's a qualia landscape. And that qualia landscape has a different set of sensory representations that different creatures have different affinities at mastering. The echolocation capabilities of a bat is something that is, in some respects, far beyond what we as conscious agents can even comprehend. We don't even know how they think about those things.
Right. I mean, what they're able to do from an auditory standpoint,
correct.
It's amazing.
And as well as you mentioned with echolocation with the dolphins, the same sort of thing. So please, I mean, don't put me in this whole boat of that. I think that there's this linear
David,
landscape. When I say landscape, right? When I say landscape, I'm thinking in terms of a manifold, right? A surface, and that surface is being probed differentially by different species based on their different experiential capabilities that they have. And again, my fundamental thesis is this concept of salience that drives the process, that jumps from one set of salience evaluations to the next. Now that's something I still need to prove, as David mentioned earlier, by actual hard science, right? Because that's ultimately how we figure anything out. And that's something that I'm working on, but just to make that distinction very clear.
I want to jump in here. Turn it over to Foxhole. I will give it right over to you right after we head over to Stanford. I want to actually hand it over to David Pierce and Andres and get their ideas of what I was actually saying about the concept of consciousness being a gray area that isn't explicit just to Homo sapiens.
Yes, I think one of the advantages of something like the thalamic bridges that Andres was touching on is that not merely we'll be able to access the consciousness of other members of our own species, but it ought to be possible to mind meld, so to speak, with members of other species too. Yes, I take seriously the possibility that something like a sperm whale, for instance, might actually be more intensely conscious than humans, which is rather disturbing in view of the way we treat cetaceans, and of course disturbing in view of the way we treat non-human animals in our factory farms and slaughterhouses. So I think it will not merely lead to an intellectual revolution, it may contribute to a moral, ethical revolution too.
Our understanding of language is actually leading to that. I mean, when the findings that we're coming across when it comes to marine mammals itself. I mean, the ability to communicate between dolphins and whales. That's something that we're coming across from research going on in this with marine mammals that is actually leading us to see that consciousness is something that is less specifically based off of the species that exist in, and is something that exists in a wide array of evolutionary offshoots, I guess would be the best way to put it. But Andres, you had something you wanted to add to it?
Yes, I wanted to mention two background assumptions that it is very common for people to have. They might be implicit. I'm not saying you believe this, but some of the comments you mentioned, and David, might sort of like give an impression of consciousness that I think is interesting to debate. So it goes as follows. Intuitively, there is a one-to-one mapping between sensory stimuli, or, so to speak, sensory modality and kind of experience. Sort of light, being able to perceive light will produce colors and shapes, whereas touching will give you that tactile sensation. But as we know from people with synesthesia, it turns out that actually that mapping is arbitrary. there are people who like look at, open their eyes and they experience the smells and they represent what they see with smells. So this mapping is actually evolutionarily advantageous, the one that we happen to have, but it's arbitrary. So
well, I have to disagree. I don't think it's arbitrary, but keep in mind that the general population doesn't experience synesthesia. So obviously, the synesthesia is a detour in some physiological sense from what is standard representation in the physiology, right? So we don't know what exactly that is. I think what it is kind of a cross signaling that's happening between these independent systems that are processing these independent modalities, right? That's what I think it is, and that's what, you know, I think in my conception that represents synesthesia. But, you know, to say that it's completely arbitrary is there's no evidence for that.
I'm not saying it's arbitrary. What I'm saying is that it could be different, and the reason why we have this mapping, it's fitness enhancing. Like this mapping happens to be a really good trick for information processing.
Absolutely.
The second background assumption was that consciousness necessarily is involved in information processing or representation, which doesn't seem to be the case. I've had sleep paralysis experiences where I've opened my eyes and see a sea of blue, very intense blue. But it doesn't mean anything. It's not processing any kind of information. And in the end, it turns out I had my eyes closed. So I just had this really strong experience of blue with no inputs coming into my body.
Andres, that's actually a very good point, and I think that's a great place for Zoltan to enter on. Zoltan, what's your general synopsis of what you've heard so far?
Well, my wife just knocked, so this will be the last thing I say. But basically, you know, first off, it's very interesting here. This is a great conversation because you have a couple non-experts and a couple true people who spend their lives studying this, and that is fascinating for the people like myself who are, of course, part of this non-expert group. But ultimately, I have to wonder with what Andre is saying regarding the blue is the entire thing just absolutely some type of neural occurrence happening with nothing else going on, no other parameters, no other significant things. It's entirely based on something physical that we're going to be able to completely make perfect sense of, or is it something that we are still not understanding yet, or something else that's into this realm of maybe quantum ideas and some of this other stuff? The bottom line is that I hear a lot of the stuff that's going on, a lot of the stuff you're saying, but it's so difficult for at least a layperson such as myself to actually say anything definite. And so, you know, it's hard to even give a good response here because I'm hearing experts talk about it, and obviously the experts know what they're talking about, but they're still searching. They're still searching. We're all searching. And so it's awesome because in a way it's the journey is, you know, half the fun to get there. But we're all a little bit lost in trying to name this exact thing. I almost thought I should go get my 7-month-old infant and bring her here and say, let's try to explain the consciousness of this baby, because I watch her do things like today for the very first time. She picked up her bottle and started feeding herself. Now this is monumental from my perspective because I no longer have to hold the bottle in the upright position to get her to actually, you know, and this is the main responsibility right now as a father. Feed this baby, have it grow, keep it alive. And today she finally learned how to hold the bottle and actually upright and feed herself. The point of the story, though, is that we're touching on some things that a lot of us have our various ideas on, and I think the experts have very good perspectives on them. But it's something that's probably going to every year that goes by now, we're going to discover new angles of it and grow and grow and grow. And, you know, hopefully in 10, 20 years we'll have a much better grasp on it. Though I even wonder if that's the case, maybe we're really just infants ourselves in discovering what consciousness is like, and it'll be something so complex, maybe we'll all be interconnected. The hive mind is something that I'm so reluctant to write on the hive mind because I know so little about it, but it's such a fascinating and bizarre concept. And to think that we could all be interconnected, I guess we already are right now in a way, but something even more complex than that would be absolutely brilliant, and nothing else, it'll be super fun, as this has been super fun.
See, that's
Before we
actually
go, I have
something
one
that I
question I'm
want
dying to
to.
ask. Sorry, I have one question though. I'm dying to ask. Has having children made you reconsider at all the first law of the transhumanist wager?
You know, I must admit, it hasn't. It has definitely not. Although, as you know from my novel, when the wife of Jethro Knight dies, this puts us in the most difficult quandary, because essentially, how much are you really willing to live? How much are you really willing to preserve your consciousness, even to the thing you love most in your life? You know, that's where I start getting into this weird quantum archaeology ideas where, well, if you could live 1,000 years, maybe you could actually even bring back those people that you love. But the problem is that if you actually lived that long and became this incredible super intelligence, would those things even matter? So we're sort of stuck with the things that matter today. And I wouldn't change the first law, but I can tell you that should I ever get put in that position between myself and my the things I love most, like my children, I'm not sure I could actually make the same decisions Jethro Knights could, just from an emotional perspective on how much I love them. But philosophically, I still stand behind that first law, which I think is the most important law, as Rowan had said, of consciousness. That consciousness must survive in order to preserve all that we are.
I think this is very well answered. Thank you.
Thank you. And gentlemen, I actually have to depart because my wife has knocked twice. And but I want to say good night to everyone, and thank you so much for having me. And if I get a chance, I will come back and watch you guys live. So
Awesome.
Thank you, Zoltan.
Thank you very much, Zoltan. Best
Nice, Zoltan.
little quantum
It's always a
supercomputer.
pleasure to have you on.
all right, great.
Let's actually break into this and go from there. I'm like, Ronan, what's your thoughts on what's been said so far?
Well, I'm a definite believer in the first law of the transhumanist wager, that we must safeguard our existence above all else. So I want to just relate this topic of consciousness to atheism, and the idea that as atheists, our worldview, we need to acknowledge the horror, the bad situation that we're all in, right? Because if atheism is true, and our consciousness is dependent on our physical brain, right? We're in a lot of trouble, because when we're all headed towards this, wall of death. So I just want to, bring up the idea that, Macbeth, he talked about this, that he said life is just sound and fury, in the end signifies nothing.
Nothing.
Because if we die and cease to exist, I just think we should all, as atheists, we need to just be honest and acknowledge the consequences of atheism. I don't think enough atheists are acknowledging that. The nightmarish reality that we're in, that we're all going to die and cease to exist, and ultimately our lives are insignificant and meaningless in the grand scheme of everything. And so let's just be honest and truthful about that and say, holy crap, we're in a lot of trouble, and let's do everything we can to safeguard our existence, as the first law states, the first law of the transhumanist wager. So that's just kind of the focus I want to, just give that perspective. Yeah, that's it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I definitely agree with you on that point. And in fact, it's been an underlying driver for a great deal about why I've been pursuing, at least in my own work, these efforts for artificial intelligence and dynamic cognition, as this is what people call AI. I think, Rowan, absolutely, that terror is something that, right? It's like, here we are, we are a living direct delta function, and it's like we're here for a blip, and then boom, we're gone. And if we do not understand what it is that we are, so that we can perpetuate it. But at the same time, I think that we're making a great deal of progress in terms of biology, in terms of what's going on with, again, I mentioned this during the last talk with regards to stem cells, and I talked about TALENs and Cas9, and how these technologies are going to be used to enable us, I think, in the next 10 to 20 years to really extend life in ways that, people really want to live life. I mean, here we are. We're lucky if we get to 80, right? On average in the human species, right? But I think in the next 20 years, the people that are alive are going to be routinely getting to 120 and 130 and even beyond that, given all the technological advance that we can bring to bear against the problem. So I like to be a relentless optimist about these things.
Well, that's actually a great point to enter on. So let's toss it over to Foxhole. He's been wanting to say something for like the last few minutes.
Well, no, I think I was just going to weigh in after the talk of preserving consciousness there. It's an interesting question, and the reason I wanted to ask Zoltan that, and the reason I've asked Rowan this before, this kind of question, is because while I share the premise of needing to preserve consciousness, of wanting to preserve consciousness, unfortunately, I guess I don't understand. I don't share the same fear of death. And I don't share the same fear of just not existing. I think that should I die and go on, my life had meaning, and so I think it's just it's an interesting way the different perspectives people value or fear different things, and it's the consciousness is a weird, strange, complicated thing.
You make a great point there, Foxhole. That's actually a great place for our person that actually is a part of the Q&A to jump in on. BJ, do you have any questions for the panel tonight?
Hey, yeah.
Okay.
Hey, what's going on, David? Really, my question is just to everyone here, and there's been a lot of talk about what consciousness could be, because we're not just there yet. We haven't yet discovered the complete workings of consciousness. So my question is to everyone, what do you believe we'll find with the evidence that we have thus far, even though it's circumstantial at best? Will it be a materialist understanding of consciousness? Will it be something along the lines of panpsychism? What do you believe to everyone consciousness will reveal itself to everyone?
Let's toss that question over to Stanford before anyone else jumps in, because I know David Saitlow is going to have a whirlwind of an answer for that one. So, Andres, David Pierce, what is your answer to the question that was posed by BJ tonight?
My answer would be, ultimately, I'm even more radical than a panpsychist. My tentative hypothesis would be that some form of monistic idealism is true. That I think that the world is exhaustively described by the equations of physics and their solutions, but the intrinsic nature of the stuff that those equations describe, recall, we have no idea what breathes fire into the equations and makes there a world for us to describe, as Stephen Hawking, the arch materialist, puts it, that I think ultimately, yes, that the stuff of the world will be consciousness. And that might seem to be a completely untestifiable, unfalsifiable conjecture. But if this is the case, and we were discussing quantum mind as a possible solution to the binding problem, this conjecture does have testable implications for the nature of our minds. What do you think, Tantros? Yeah.
Yes, I tend to think panpsychism is the most likely scenario. I haven't discarded dualism, but I don't give it a very high probability, maybe 1% or so. But it would be a scientific dualism. It definitely, I think, you require more sophisticated models than the ones that Descartes had. I think there's a lot of things that can be worked out there. But the bulk of my probability would go to panpsychism. One thing that I wanted to add is that with regards to the fear of death, it is a empirical fact that a large percentage of people, when they take LSD and have this tremendous experience of altered states, they come back and they say something like, we are all one consciousness, and they stop fearing death to a large extent. I mean, they stop identifying with their own body, or the brain that instantiates their consciousness, and they identify with consciousness as a whole. And I think that's something that will be really interesting too. That also our conceptions of self and our relationship to the cosmos will tremendously change once we start to explore consciousness more thoroughly.
I think it's kind of like, why do some people fear spiders and some people don't? You know what I mean? I think that's got a lot to do with the death question. I think there's a variety of reasons that some people fear it, but maybe not so much, or some people really, really fear death and just don't want any, and it's an interesting question why we're so different in that way, especially when we're all built so similar. Going to the question of consciousness, why does a consciousness work so differently for people?
Well, as someone who fears death, let me just jump in here and let me try to explain it for you guys who don't quite understand from my perspective. Okay, let me just tell you why I fear death. Life, okay, if our life is just a blip, and then it's followed by nothingness, and before our life was nothingness, so if we're just this little line of life, to
Direct
me,
delta function.
ultimately it just seems insignificant. It just seems meaningless. I mean, Foxhole, you said like your life had meaning, right? But the thing is, it's past tense. Once you're dead, once you cease to exist, there's no meaning from that point on, right? It's like your life had meaning while it was alive, but once you stop existing, it's meaningless from that point on. So that sucks.
No. Foxhole has a good point, because if you think about it, if his consciousness ends when he dies, then what does he care about if any other representative consciousness is observing that event and is saying that, oh, there's no more meaning after this point, right? From Foxhole's perspective, he's already content, right, in the life that he's lived. It has been a life which has been fulfilling to him, and it's over, and that's okay. So I understand that. I can look at both sides of the equation. I'm thinking from my perspective, though, that I want to be in control of the button. I want to be able to say when I'm done. All right, it's as simple as that.
Indeed.
Right. So if Foxhole is cool with like whatever he gets to when he's done, then fine. I'm okay with that.
And I feel like my life did have meaning. I mean, I have children who have a lifetime of lessons I've taught them, who will grow up and have experience based on what I taught them. And so I feel like my life had good impact. Things that I do just like this. These things have an impact on people. And so I'm quite proud of those things. And even if life were extended, and I lived 3, 5, 900, several thousand years, I still think at some point I'd be ready to push that button.
Push the button.
See, for me, I've actually got to jump in right there. See, for me, I wouldn't push the button, because there's always something to explore in the universe. There's always something to expand your base knowledge on. And for me, reason and logic and just research and knowing as much as possible is what drives me. And if I can live forever, if I could basically go out into the universe, explore it until the end of time itself, that's something that would actually help me and give me meaning. Not just the meaning of the lives I've touched. Don't get me wrong, the moral implications of the people that I've actually been able to help along the way and that will survive me long past my date of expiration is something that I look forward to, and that's something that I'm happy about. But if I can actually see those practices, see the people's lives that I've touched, and see them implement the lessons I've taught them and exist past that, that's something that will give me meaning. I've got to go with Ronan on this one. I've got to say that the transhumanist in me, the person that wants to see a better future for my species, wants to live forever. It wants to be a part of what makes my species great and what makes I want to see my species stretch out past the stars. I want to see a biplanetary species in my lifetime. I want to be able to say that humanity lives on 2 planets within my little time on this blue marble. I want to see us start colonizing. That's something, if I could see that, that would give me hope for the future. And with that being said, I want to hand this back over to Stanford and get David Pierce's thoughts on this.
I have to agree with every word you've said there. I think a lot of people, if you
You've
mention...
inspired me. David, what can I say? You have inspired. You are one of the reasons that I am a transhumanist. Your books, your works have spoken to me on a personal level, and I want to say thank you for that. But sorry for cutting you off. Go ahead and say what you want to say.
As I said, that's why I write stuff. I'll never be a man of action, but I hope to, shall we say, inspire those people who are men of action and women of action. Anyway, back to what I was saying. Yes, I think we should tackle the scourge of aging. Some people say that they would be bored living indefinite lifespans, but the challenges of it's far, far easier to master the biology of mood than it is to master the biology of aging. And so if it seems likely that there isn't any fundamental law of nature that says that organic robots must grow old and die, any more than there is silicon robots. And if we can ensure that we can all enjoy indefinite lifespans, I think we'll almost certainly be extremely fulfilled, live rich, complicated lives. It'll be far, far better than Christian heaven. Temperamentally, I'm a pessimist, an incredibly dark pessimist. But I do think the future of life in the universe does lie in, super happiness, super longevity, and super intelligence. And I think a triple S civilization is coming. The big unknown is timescales. I'm personally a little bit skeptical that I'm going to make it, but some of the younger members of the panel, I think they're in with a good shot.
If I were to add something to that is, I think, well, two brief things. The first one is David uses a really good example for like how heaven on earth might look like, and that is essentially reading the experiences that people have on MDMA. However controversial / neurotoxic this substance may be, it does enable people to experience certain things that are beyond the common human experience and are completely filled with love and selfless joy towards others and wanting to help all sentient beings is fabulous. We just need to find a better technique to get those conscious experiences. The second thing I wanted to mention was to Rohan. I totally understand if my metaphysical background assumptions were that I was born and that there's a continuous stream of consciousness, that it is me, who is distinct of all the other streams of consciousness, I would be completely terrified of death. And I was terrified of death until I was 16 years old. And I had an experience that really made me question whether that model of identity was correct. And one metaphor I thought about at the time, and I think it's very useful, it goes as follows, that with a lighter, you can provide the physical conditions for fire to arise, and you can let a lighter continue to produce fire, and the fire, so to speak, could believe that it is the lighter. But in reality, the fire is fire. It's just a physical phenomenon. And wherever you find the physical conditions for fire, there the fire will be. Likewise, right now it happens that this brain is gathering the physical conditions necessary for a subjective experience, and it does seem that it's continuous over time. But when I understand who I am really, it's not this particular body or this particular brain, it's the phenomena of consciousness itself. And that's why I think it's actually impossible to die, because even if your body stops, other places will still continue to produce consciousness, and that's where you will be, because we are all one, from this point of view.
But yes, that's actually a great point to hand it over to the saint of the panel, David St. Lowe. What's your thoughts on the topic? Then we'll go into BJ's closing thoughts on it. Then we'll go into closing thoughts all around. So, David St. Lowe, what are your thoughts today, Saint?
Yeah, so, well, something that Andres mentioned, well, actually what Foxhole mentioned about, you know, him feeling that in his life, if he goes now, it's really a sense of fulfillment that he's looking for, and then after that fulfillment is done, he's okay. He doesn't care what happens afterwards. And then you mentioned, Mike, that you know, you wanted to explore the universe, and And I think it's okay for anyone to choose whatever they want to do and have that button available. And if they want to push that button when they're ready, then that's all good, right? You know, some of us, like you and I, Mike, we could end up at a Monocerata's V838. We could be checking out that incredible, you know, star, whatever the hell it's doing, right? You know, it's like a mystery in space. You know,
My
that would
dream
be
is actually to end up at Alpha Centauri. I want to see
well,
Alpha Centauri is where I want to head. That's
okay,
what
well,
I want to see the
You'll
gravitational
have
force.
time to go to both.
yeah, we could go to both, right? So
Exactly.
Monocerotis or Alpha Centauri or any one of these nebula out there or whatever, absolutely, I'd be right next to you before I push that button. But I'm all for enabling people to push the button whenever the hell they want. You know, having achieved a level of contentment in this thing, whatever it is, right? And then with some sense of honor, like said, okay, I'm done, and then clock out. You know, so that's really all I wanted to say.
Great thoughts, David. I love your train of thought always. I love how much we actually agree on certain topics. I mean, I never thought I would agree with somebody from the city, but I guess I was wrong on that aspect.
Same state, brother. Remember, same state.
Very true, my friend, very true. So, BJ, your thoughts. What to your own question, what do you think? Should we be able to push the button, or should we not be able to push the button?
Well, I agree with pretty much David's point of view is that everyone has the right to push the button whenever they so choose. And I believe that is the point, that it's a choice. That's the goal of a transhumanist, that everyone is given the choice to live or die. It's kind of like a Dr. Kevorkian 2.0. And
I love that.
That's pretty good.
That's a beautiful way to say it.
The goal of a transhumanist is for every future death to be a suicide, to where people will choose when they want to go out, and they'll choose how long they wish to live. And I believe that's going to be the ultimate question for people, because a lot of people want to live to 1,000 years old. You know, they don't want to stay, you know, in some boxed-in reality of theirs that is only up to about 80 to 100 years old. But then some people are content with that, and that's fine. And they should be able to make that choice.
Let's actually, that's a great answer. Thank you for answering that question, and thank you for joining us tonight, BJ. Let's actually go into closing thoughts. We'll start over at Stanford with the dynamic duo known as Andres and the amazing, monumental David Pierce. So, what are your guys' thoughts in closing tonight? What's your guys' thoughts in closing?
Okay, just to close off. Yes, we've talked a lot about life extension tonight. Yes, sadly, there are many sentient beings in the world today for whom time hangs heavy and life lasts too long. But I think the different strands of the transhumanist movement do fit together, and what we all ought to be aiming for is a future in which no one wants to die, and of course, just as important, no one needs to die. And so, yes, as I said, I would urge anyone listening to get involved in the transhumanist movement and work for a triple S civilization of, as I said, super happiness, super longevity, and super intelligence.
Cool. I agree with David. My closing point will be, so I think, like, David might think that the word singularity is like awfully badly defined. I think if a singularity happens of some sort, some kind of recursively self-improving intelligence, whatever it may be, it might be through a combination of nootropics, psychedelics, optogenetics, changes in the brain structure made by a couple of researchers on themselves, and they will iterate over and essentially become super intelligent that way. If you are better because of a nootropic that actually works very significantly, you will become better at actually manufacturing better nootropics. So the study of consciousness and how it works and what it is, I think not only is profoundly significant for our well-being, but will also create this actual feedback loop of intelligence, and that's something to be in the lookout for. And if anybody wants to join me in the project, I'm all ears. And yeah, well, thanks.
It's always a pleasure, Andres. Thank you for being here, guys. David St. Lo! Thoughts in closing, please.
So I just wanted to take it back to thinking in terms of, we were talking about the future of consciousness. So people like myself who are working in technology are actually trying to build these creatures. And you all probably in the last few weeks saw the quip that Elon Musk gave when he was asked what about AI, and he was very, very forward in saying that we don't want to let the demon out of the box. And I think that is a fundamentally important thing that people who are trying to approach attempts at creating consciousness need to really pay a lot of attention to. That we do not create these what I call pathological cognitive models. Maybe they're not even fully conscious, but if we give them control and power over our machines and our systems, and then they decide that we're irrelevant fluff, then we'll have trouble. And I know it's very HAL 2000, it's very Terminator 2, but this is a fundamental danger that we are facing, and I think it's very important for us to fully understand the cognitive landscape, the qualiescape that we've been talking about before we get there. So, and that's something that, you know, that the salience theory that I mentioned earlier is trying to at least create a kind of quantifiable approach to understand what those attributes are that can create pathological entities and avoid them, right? Because we don't want those. We don't, especially we don't want them in control of our cars when we're autonomously driving to California.
Very true, David, and thank you for making such beautiful points. Foxhole Atheist, Randy, my wingman as always, my brother from another mother. What's your thoughts in closing tonight?
Well, let's let Rowan go ahead. I'll go last.
Why can't I go last?
Well, you can, but let's let Rowan go ahead.
Rowan, what's your thoughts in closing?
My thoughts are, when it comes to consciousness, there's this tendency for people to be very wishful and optimistic about its continuation after death, and just very, you know, they tend to minimize the severity and the magnitude of death, which is that death could be final. Like, let's acknowledge that. Let's acknowledge the horror of that situation. We don't, anything other than that is wishful thinking. It's, you know, as far as our consciousness, what it looks like is that it's just a process of the material brain. So that's bad news. We're in a lot of trouble. And let's pay attention to the worst case scenario instead of indulging, you know, these best case scenarios that, you know, our consciousness is gonna, we're all one consciousness and all this stuff that cannot be proven. Let's take consideration of the worst case scenario, which is that when our brain is destroyed, it's over, and you know, it sucks, and that's why I would just encourage everyone to never push the button. Okay, never push the button on your life ever, because
that's a beautiful point.
Because it's final, right? It's final. Why would you? You can never come back from death. And everyone who's dead right now and ceases to exist, they can't have any more fun ever again. They can't have any more beautiful experiences. Nothing. It sucks. And if that creates fear for you, like this idea, this is what I'm talking about, creates fear, and that's uncomfortable for people, and that's why they tend to indulge in all these wishful thoughts of death. But consider that the fear of death isn't necessarily a bad thing. The fear of death can actually motivate you to take your life, your health, everything, to take everything seriously, because you understand that this existence is all you have, and you can use that fear as actually a power, as a superpower to help you survive.
That's a great point, Ronan, and I gotta say, thank you for making that point tonight. Foxhole, keep it short. What you got for us?
Well, I just want to clarify something on this position. You know, personally, I think that let's just say I went tomorrow. I think that, and I knew I was going to go. I think I could die content, knowing that I've taught my children to be very intelligent. But if I have a choice to live for a very long, lengthy period of time, yeah, sure, I'm going to grab that. My button pushing concept there is a kind of thing that I talk about. I think of long into the future. You know, when I've explored enough solar systems and enough stars, and you know, I feel like I've learned everything I care to learn. I'm not finding much new. I may be ready to push that button one day. It's hard to say, but I have to consider that as a possibility. And I think that I can have both of those positions. I can have my cake and eat it too. I can have a infinite or finite life and still have fulfillment either way.
That's a beautiful point to make, Foxhole. Thank you for touching upon that in your closing. Now, my final thoughts on this topic is that everything that we've discussed tonight, we have to remember that consciousness isn't something that is based on just being a Homo sapien. There is points to consciousness that can be found in many other species on our planet. And having a respect for what consciousness actually is and extending it out past our own species is something that will allow us to at least have a better hope for the future when a singularity or something like that occurs. Because at least we will respect it for the intellectual premise in which it comes from. And that's basically what I want to say in closing. Respect consciousness is in any way, shape, and or form, because we may find that one thing that links consciousness to the future in the most unknown of places. So, with that actually being said, the age of reason is upon us, so prepare.